Well, hello there. How is everyone? I hope you are all well on this fantabulous Monday. It's Marvellous Monday. And we've started a new week, and you're looking absolutely marvellous. You must have had a good weekend, and it shows. It shows. Anyway, we're talking about Idaho 4 case today. Going to be doing a live later at the back end of the day. So this is video 1 of 3. So keep your eyes peeled. We know that YouTube notifications have been sketchy, but not quite as sketchy as Idaho 4. And why are we talking about the Idaho 4 case again? I hear you say. And it's because of this. We've had this hearing. And out of this hearing that we recently had, one of the biggest rumours that was pushed out was dispelled, if you like. And that is the stalking situation. Brian Kohberger was not stalking. It was said, the prosecution themselves, out of the horse's mouth, it was said that the stalking rumours were untrue. And not only that, but also, in addition to the not stalking, the social media following was also inaccurate. And this is important. And I don't feel that many people understand why that is so important. And we're going to talk a bit about that today. And in a little while as well, we're going to be looking at the 4chan situation. I'm sure that the majority of you have been exposed to some of it, but we're going to touch on some of it, and which leads us into this frat and the fight situation, the situation with David Loach, and just look at how that can play into the Idaho 4 situation and what happened on that night. Because look, this is the way I look at it. And I spoke about this briefly on last night's live, but I know, lives aren't for everyone. And I say this multiple times, and they're not. So I do these bite-sized chunks as well. So people who, depending on how they want to consume their content, they get the opportunity to do it here. Because I'm a giver. I'm a giver of multiple things. And look, so at the end of the day, whoever did this crime went into 1122 King Road to commit it. And they committed this crime on a Saturday night. On a Saturday night after football. This was a Davies University versus Idaho University football match. So match day. I don't know what they're like in America and around these places, but in the UK, when it's a match day, there's drinking, there's fun, there's camaraderie. There's also fights and arguments and those more negative things. But look, the person chose to go into this house this night. So for Brian Kohberger to fit that narrative, you have to kind of think to yourself, okay, so was he stalking the property? Was he stalking it? Because he could have learned about the property, couldn't he? Through stalking. And I think that's what makes people look into that. And even now, when it's come out of the horse's mouth and said he wasn't stalking, they won't quite let go of it. They can't let go of it. Because already that seed has been sown and they've built their entire foundation of belief around it. Because that's technically the only thing that makes sense. That this person was able to come to this property, get into this property, know where to go, know who would be in there, and exactly where they'd be, and they'd done reconnaissance, because that's surely what people do. They stalk their prey, and then they attack, and then they leave. So that makes sense. That makes that whole Brian Kohberger story make sense. But even in that vein, there's still elements of that don't make sense. Because you have to think to yourself, so why this night? If he was stalking this area, if he was stalking the house, if he was stalking the victims, then why would he have gone into this property on a night that, based on what's going on around it, this was perhaps the worst possible night to do this? The worst possible night. Especially if people believe that Madison, for instance, was the intended target. because surely football night, that means that Madison would have had more people around her. They could have walked into that house, there could have been 20, 30 people. Madison may not have even been there, because what we've learnt in the short period of time that we've been following this case is that this house would have parties that would have an abundance of people there, and not necessarily the people who live there. So my thought sort of process takes me back to, surely for this to have worked, someone would have either had to been watching that property on the night and seeing what was going on from quite early on to see who was coming, who was going. Because surely if you're into the reconnaissance element of this and stalking and watching, and you've made a decision on this night to do this crime, then surely it makes more sense to have been doing your reconnaissance earlier and watching from earlier, so you know that you're not walking into an ambush. But that's not the story we get from Brian Koberger's sort of version of this story. That is that he left around 2:30 in the evening, or 3 o'clock, whatever, and he heads over here. So it's almost like he knew when they got home, and he knew who was in the house, and more importantly, knew who wasn't in the house. It's an odd situation, isn't it? It's a situation that makes you kind of think, this is a head scratcher. This is a head scratcher. But anyway, I digress. Because we've now been told by the prosecution that there was no stalking. So there was no stalking, and there was no following of a victim on social media. And we've been told by Ann Taylor that there is no connection between her client and the victims. And not only that, we've heard the defense team say that they believe Brian Koberger is innocent. And I know people are turning around and saying, well, he's pulled the wool over their eyes. But to say that they believe that he is innocent, that is not something that is stated on a regular basis by the defense team. It's not. And those who believe it is they are naive. You know, that the defense, especially public defenders, they have they're duty bound to do a job, but it doesn't mean they have to believe in their client's innocence. But to say we believe in his innocence, and it's an honor to be working towards, you know, his day in court, working alongside him. But stalking. So if he wasn't stalking, and he wasn't following them on social media, then what was his connection to them? Because I put it to you a different sort of way of looking at this. And that is that, just say you've got somebody who wants to commit an atrocity like this. They just want to go in and they want to take the lives of multiple people in a house. Would 1122 King Road have been the best choice? The house that seems to stick out like a sore thumb because there's always an abundance of people in there. This is the house that police are generally called to because there are noise complaints. That's not a house that an opportunistic crime you would believe would take place. This is the house that would almost be one that I think you'd cross off your list, and you'd go to a house that was perhaps quieter. You're more likely to be able to get in and get out without the added risk of walking in to the aforementioned ambush scenario, because you walk in and there's 20 drunk sort of teens and young adults, some of them quite able-bodied, and some of them could have been quite angry, fueled with alcohol and steroids. And that takes me onto this for a second. We're just going to briefly look at this. And this is the 4chan posts. And look, again, I'm sure that the vast majority of you have been exposed to these. Some of you won't have, but there was an abundance of this. And this was basically talking about this situation. There was an ongoing situation where there were fallouts, there was arguments, there was potential fights, and some of you didn't hear about this fight, but I can tell you, some of us spoke directly to Cara. I have spoken to her, others have spoken to her, and there was indeed a fight at the frat house between Ethan, Xana, and other individuals. That happened. So just let that settle and simmer for a second. And just as we look at some of these, this is talking about the situation when you take steroids, and they talk about shriveled balls and all sorts, and we can kind of see a bit of a funny side to that, but it's not, and it's a real issue here, and I've spoken about this before. I don't mean shriveled balls are a real issue, even though they are a real issue if you take vast copious amounts of steroids. But the importance, what you've got to understand with this is that there appears to be an issue with these students. They don't all get on. They're not all friends. And this fight was a fight that was bad enough that Xana's family members were going to drive back down to Moscow to check if things are okay. And again, I've spoken about this briefly myself. Now, this is one of the people in question. Let's go across again. This is Loach, and I'm not saying he's done anything. I'm just saying that with respect of the Idaho 4 situation, and with these fights and arguments in the background, and people who are unhappy with some members of this property, does the Brian Koberger narrative make the most sense? Does it make the most sense? Why would Brian Koberger in Washington, a PhD student, decide on this specific night, at this specific time in the morning, just to up sticks, drive over to Moscow, Idaho, go to this specific house on this specific night, again, a football night, a night when people are potentially drunk, partying, a few people in there, to walk into this house to commit this crime? Just say, for argument's sake, if you're someone who believes that Madison was the target, Maddie Mogan, why this night? Why not wait for a night when it's quieter, a Tuesday night? Why a football night? Why a football? Why would somebody go into there? So I think to myself, well, surely if someone's going to go into this house on their own, without anybody, without any help, they've got to be quite brazen, haven't they? They've got to fancy their chances. So I think to myself, who would Brian fancy his chances? Now, if he was, say, a trained killer, for instance, if he was a military man who had this kind of training, that might give him the confidence. Now, did he have that training? Was someone giving him that training and he had that confidence? There's nothing that would suggest that he had that kind of confidence to do this kind of crime under these circumstances. I haven't seen it yet. But what would make somebody go into this house on this night, football night, and potentially face a load of people? And I conclude that there's only two people, and that is a person who knew who was in that house on that night. 100% knew. They knew they weren't walking into an ambush. They knew it. And the second person is someone who was so filled with rage that it didn't matter who was in there. They were just going in there. They were going in there because the person that they were trying to get to was in that house. This weren't just opportunistic. They couldn't have just gone into a more quiet house, one that they had been reconnaissance on, and this was about 1122 King Road. And nothing else matters. The rage took over, and they went into this house to do this crime. They didn't have to go upstairs. Steve Gonsalves quote. which would lead me to believe, based on the fact that Jack DeCure had stayed with them in the days following this, I believe that very early on, Steve Gonsalves believed that this fight was a catalyst to what happened. And he believed that Xana and or Ethan were the original targets. And that's why whoever did this didn't have to go upstairs. Now, what happened to take the eyes off of that situation? When even the people at Ground Zero were looking at this situation early on, in my opinion, and that is that the interjection of this Brian Koberger scenario, this jump the gun in, took front and center. And what did that do? That gave the university, it gave Moscow, Idaho, an outsider to focus on, to take the eyes off the students, to take the eyes off the university, to avoid this spiraling into something that could affect the community, affect business as usual. And they needed to factor in some things to help that along their way. And that brings me to the things like the knife sheath. Was the knife sheath planted? And you can turn around and say I'm a tinfoil hat, but I want you to answer me a question. Can you genuinely and honestly and with a straight face put in the comments that you believe that never do law enforcement ever fabricate evidence, plant evidence in order to obtain an outcome of a crime that they are staring down the barrel of? Can you honestly say that that never happens? Now, I'm not saying it did happen in this, but I'm saying that I believe that there is a possibility that that is exactly what happened. And again, I'm just simply asking, can you put down below that you don't believe that that ever happens? Because there were incentives in this for it to happen. And they can't be ignored. They can't be ignored. And if you've been paying attention, you'll know what these things were. But Brian Koberger, does he truly make the most sense in this? When you remove stalking, surely if he was stalking them, if he was following them on social media and sliding into their DMs, and he had indeed been, caught on the house Wi-Fi that we've been told, then that makes more sense. But you remove them out of the equation, does it then still make sense? Did this fight have anything to do with it? And the exculpatory evidence of Bethany Funk, what was it? Keep your eyes out for video 2, because this wasn't just about the knife sheath. This was about wrapping this entire thing up in a neat little bow, and it needed something else to happen. And perhaps it needed some pretty little lies to help them. And in video 2, we're going to be talking about them one last time. I'll catch you then.